Hello, my name is Dr. Michael Glass, and I'm the Regional Studies Association's Territorial Chair for the United States. The Regional Studies Association is a learned society concerned with the analysis of regions and regional issues. Through our international membership, we provide an authoritative voice of and network for academics, students, practitioners, and policymakers. You can find out more about the RSA, including information on membership, funding opportunities, and events at regionalstudies.org. I'm pleased to present a new installment of our Regionalists on Film series that introduces you to the work of established and emerging regional scholars and their scholarship. Today, it's my special privilege to introduce Dr. John Stehlin. Dr. Stehlin is an assistant professor of geography, environment, and sustainability at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Dr. Stehlin's work examines new mobility infrastructures and how they intervene in the production of urban space. John, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate you taking the time.
Not a problem. Now, if we could get started with the first question for you. I'm sure everybody's interested in how you first got interested in researching issues of regions and regional development.
Right. Well, in some ways, I sort of worked backwards to it. I started my PhD at Berkeley with a kind of maybe a naive or almost autobiographical question about bicycling and left politics. What I saw as kind of the energy of the anti-globalization and anti-war movement being sort of displaced into this kind of maybe more personal politics or politics of the everyday, et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of where I began. And then when I started looking at what kind of political activity bicycle advocates, et cetera, actually engaged in, it became clear that they were specifically engaging in bicycle infrastructure and planning, which led me into the planning process and how it connected to various forms of urban change, particularly gentrification. I had initially aimed to examine how bicycle infrastructure projects in San Francisco, Portland, and Detroit were sort of in part of this regional, not this regional necessarily, but this urban development story. For reasons of lack of funding, et cetera, et cetera, I reframed the project around this kind of scalar tension between changes at the neighborhood level and the kind of regional structure in the San Francisco Bay Area. You have these particular nodes in the urban fabric that become very livable, bicycle friendly in this particular context, et cetera, but they're embedded within this broader region in which automobiles are still quite dominant. So I did bring this comparative dimension back in with my book, Cyclescapes of the Unequal City, expanding to bring in material from Detroit and Philadelphia, again, with a kind of a more regional perspective as well. And so I think from that, this scale question has really been a persistent theme in my work since. Questions like, at what scale are infrastructural changes conceptualized and governed? What kind of new scales of social, economic, and political life, we might add also ecological life, are being created? And at what scale do we achieve more just urban futures? And a lot of this comes back to my training at Berkeley, reading scholars like Doreen Massey, et cetera, and again, she was coming from regional science as well, and that kind of came through a kind of more kind of critical Marxian informed kind of geographical training as well. So that's the sort of, in the nutshell, of how I came around to sort of barging into regionalism in a way.
Would you say that the interest in micromobilities and issues of cycling has been an emergent trend in scholarship, or is this part of an ongoing conversation that's been around for a while?
I mean, I felt like there's been a lot of planning work on bicycle infrastructure, especially that's been, fairly normative, usually done by planners who want to see more of it, right? For good reason, right? I'm a bicyclist and a bicycle advocate, so I'm sort of critiquing the things I support. It's kind of a critique from the same side, so to speak. In terms of the kind of regional question, I did feel like the regional question was often a little bit absent in some bicycle scholarship and bicycle advocacy. Something as simple as, you know, if you looked at where bicycle advocates were focusing their efforts in the San Francisco Bay Area in, say, the 1980s, it was very much in suburban recreational riding, right? In largely white, very pleasant suburbs, trying to make those safer for recreational cyclists, et cetera, et cetera. As the 90s and 2000s wear on and you have increasing numbers of people cycling in central cities, particularly the constituency of bicycle advocacy organizations, which are predominantly white, and in this period, fairly male as well, you see the sort of center of gravity of activities shift in that direction as well. The advocacy organization that I looked at, that I kind of spent the most time with in the San Francisco Bay Area, which was Bike East Bay, did notionally cover something like, I think it was like 35 municipalities, right? Did notionally cover the whole eastern side of the San Francisco Bay Area. But in practice, a lot of that energy was really focused in key corridors in gentrifying parts of Oakland.
Nice. Now, part of your recent work on cycling infrastructure has involved platform mobilities. And there's a burgeoning interest in how these new technologies are shaping urban and regional futures. Could you tell us a little bit more about what platform mobilities are and perhaps what the geographic perspective on that issue is contributing to your scholarship? Right.
So, I mean, this is, again, a situation where I came to it because it came to me in a way. In the simplest sense, you know, a platform is an infrastructure that intermediates and coordinates interactions and transactions between multiple other parties, right? It doesn't have to be digital, but the digital platforms are sort of why everybody is talking about platforms in a lot of ways. And I think, you know, one of the big intersections is that rather than, say, producing goods and services, right, they're the sort of the pathway through which consumers and producers are connected. And so in a kind of strict Marxian sense, they generate rents rather than profits, right? And so this is part of discussions of the rentier economy, et cetera, the Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism, et cetera. This has been debated in geography and elsewhere. People like Jathan Sadowski talking about the sort of the platform rents, and then people like Evgeny Morozov kind of pushing back against it being only rents and thinking about platforms, and Jathan as well doing some of this work thinking about platforms as fixed capital, right, as dead labor as well through the work of engineering, et cetera, et cetera. Nevertheless, you know, as I said, it doesn't have to be digital platforms, but, you know, Google, Facebook, Amazon, eBay, Airbnb, or kind of major touchstones in studying platform capitalism. And as I said, I came to it not via digital geographies, but because the infrastructures that I was studying, which were bike share systems, and specifically I was in Austin, Texas in 2018, I was there to study the kind of conventional bike share system that was being run by a nonprofit management company. It was a kind of it was sort of a not-for-profit provider of bike share services, right? It was all very, very conventional stuff. And the world of bike share in general was very much these conventional public-private partnerships. The direct lineage was through street furniture contracts. So it wasn't even necessarily transportation related, it was advertising related. It was JC Decaux and Clear Channel who developed the sort of the third wave that gained a lot of notoriety from places like Barcelona, Montreal, New York City, et cetera, et cetera. But all of a sudden, all of this kind of sector was being platformized. You had the Uber model being applied by venture capital funded startups. Again, these were initially actually from East Asia, to all different forms of urban transportation to sort of see what would stick and what would grow market share, because market share is sort of the currency of the realm in the world of platforms. And so when I was in Austin, you had these firms, Ofo and Mobike from China, that had developed floating or dockless bike share services that just used phones to locate and unlock bikes. And so they were just kind of being placed everywhere. They were entering US markets through tactics that were very similar to Uber. And then you had Uber and Lyft rushing to buy traditional bike share providers in order to kind of apply their model and to maybe stop losing a little bit of market share to bike sharing. And then you had scooter companies like Lime and Bird that just skipped bikes altogether. And the whole field started, in a matter of months, started to become something more like digitally augmented walking, right? That happens to generate a vast amount of data on people's movements that wasn't being captured before in the same way. To bring it to the kind of geographical question, and the reason that I find the mobility question very interesting, of course, all platforms are material, whether you're talking about where data are located, where the labor of programming is done, et cetera, where the servers are, what kind of energy sources they require. But especially these mobility platforms, Uber, Mobike, Bird, what have you, they really intervene in what's really a kind of a classic geographical concept of the friction of distance, right? That this kind of stubbornly material aspect of moving people or moving things to people, if you want to bring in Uber Eats or Deliveroo, those kind of the delivery platforms that have, of course, proliferated during COVID under very precarious circumstances for the workers involved, right? All of these are kind of, it's a fundamental geographical question. And part of what these kind of mobility platforms are doing are and re-intermediating existing relationships between people and space and their destinations, right? And sort of producing new but very kind of fluid scales of mobility, right? And so that, again, to me is a very kind of that's the bread and butter of thinking sort of geographically. And so in my paper with Mike Hodson and Andy McMeekin that I produced as a postdoctoral associate at a research associate at the University of Manchester's Sustainable Consumption Institute, we were sort of examining the field of mobility platforms as a whole and came around to this idea of thinking of them as a kind of a fragile spatial fix. So again, very much drawing on Marxist geography, David Harvey and his interlocutors, and thinking about the way that platforms were sort of interstitially and relinking certain parts of cities that were frequented by their target populations, which are essentially urbanites with disposable income. Some platforms did begin to, usually with coaxing or with more planning with state agencies, et cetera, did begin to intervene at a more regional scale. A couple of them that I can think of were in Germany, sort of exurban or rural on-demand transport, right? But most of them were almost kind of doubling down on the centrality of the central city, because that's where the largest market was for the kind of the ancillary functions of platforms, which is delivering users to potential advertisers and other platforms that provide related services.
Right. I think that the questions about mobility and friction and the very classic ideas about the types of production and reproduction of inequality that these new systems, regardless of the rhetoric around fluidity, mobility, and so forth, are really important ones to look at. Now, more recently, you're beginning to look at issues to do with, say, highway removal and other things. So you're dealing with mobility at several different scales in your work. How do those different scales of analysis help us to think regionally about some of these questions?
Yeah, again, my route to this was somewhat circuitous, right? In a way, I started to think about the kinds of spaces that were created, that were being created kind of in a complementary fashion as part of whether you're talking about creating bicycle infrastructure that is then used by scooter share users as well. You're creating sort of parking zones for dockless bikes and scooters, et cetera. You're creating a whole kind of urban realm in which that's kind of very much intersects with placemaking, right? In a very kind of classic way. So again, you mentioned that there's a certain hype. Most mobility platforms are still not really regional solutions. This is what Will Payne and I have discussed in recent papers. They may modestly expand or extend the sort of last mile of mass transit, but they're very much localized around these specific nodes. And they don't often offer a lot to the urban peripheries that are becoming the only areas that are affordable to working class people, people of color, and new immigrants, et cetera. At the same time, so at maybe a particular scale, as you mentioned, the neighborhood scale, and the scale question is just always, it's sort of what I think through. The driver of automobility at the regional scale is the relationship between the locations of home, work, social reproduction, and leisure, right? And the extent to which those can be replaced with non-automobile trips. And so, there's this kind of almost torsion, right? You have the intensive production of certain kinds of spaces, and you have the extensive urbanization sort of surrounding cities. Maybe you have some intensive nodes within that extended urbanization, but especially in the United States, but in a lot of other places, you see increasingly, if not a sprawl mode of development of single family homes scattered across the landscape, you still have these sort of nodes of intensive activity that are often really only accessible by cars, right? And so thinking about that regional question is essential for identifying the limitations of things that you would otherwise support, right? A kind of more intensive form of urbanism, a more socially just and inclusive form of intensive urbanism as well, right? Where you don't depend on automobiles for everyday life, a car optional city rather than a car dependent city, et cetera, et cetera. And so I kind of talked about how a lot of this was embedded in regional relationships that we shouldn't even necessarily say demand that bike infrastructure solve, right? The agglomeration of urban cores of creative, quote unquote, creative work accessible to gentrifying neighborhoods, and the dispersal of sites like Amazon fulfillment centers, right, to the peripheries, right? We wouldn't necessarily expect, even if people wanted to be able to access those jobs at the periphery by bicycle, right? Or even bike share or shared vehicle or car share or what have you, right? So kind of to bring this to my more recent work, thinking about, so my current work, which is sort of incipient, but I recently had the opportunity to make some site visits in both the US and Spain, where I'm looking at highway removal, not just highway removal, but highway burial, really kind of punches up these sort of scale questions, right? You can have a situation, for example, in Rochester, where the inner loop, part of the inner loop highway that was built in the 1970s, like most other 60s and 70s, like most other auto infrastructure, was removed to sort of reconnect the neighborhood. Similarly, this massive infrastructure project to bury the M30 highway along the Manzanares River in Madrid. These have succeeded really in reconnecting the urban fabric, creating much more pleasant places. And in places like San Francisco and Portland and Seoul, where these projects have been done, you have often this sort of contradictory aspect where the place becomes, you remove this detrimental effect of a highway, a flyover or this major barrier along the surface, and you make it a much better place. A lot of that betterness gets converted into the land market, right? It immediately becomes capitalized in the form of rents. Again, you see this in Seoul, you see this in San Francisco, you see this in Portland, you see it with Boston's Big Dig project, all of these types of projects. In the case of, in all of these cases, they also, to my mind, have not necessarily affected regional development patterns, right? Which are, again, kind of dependent on the structure of the road network as a whole. They're often kind of removing a section of highway that's maybe underutilized, right? And the fact that it's underutilized kind of gives you a sense that it's maybe not the kind of performing a sort of vertebrating function, right? A sort of a constitutive function in the structure of the region necessarily. Or the burial of the highway, again, in the case of Madrid, but a new plan to bury another section of highway that accesses that buried highway, will at least maintain, if not actually expand, automobile access, right? That sort of displaces some of the contradictions of living right next to a highway. People's houses are less than 2 meters from this highway in some cases. Displaces those contradictions to the mouth of the tunnel, right? Or to a suburban area that continues to have good capacity to the road network and thus expands further outward, right? And so again, these are the tension between these sort of scales of intervening in infrastructure, right? The tension between what you might call urban priorities of intensive urbanization and regional or national or even international in the case of Spain, right? A lot of this comes from EU funding, or their crucial roads that connect Spain to Portugal and France, right? How these get expressed through infrastructure or its removal, right? And what you often see is that these infrastructures are very obdurate, in the words of Anike Hummels, right? They kind of stick around, they're hard to remove. And you see really significant tensions between these agendas that have sort of scalar representatives, although in the case of regions, it's often this sort of inchoate sense of maintaining regional flow versus a kind of maybe more a localized sense of the need to enhance or recover qualities of place.
All right, thank you so much. Now, we're coming to the close of our time, but I wonder if you'd care to reflect on what you see about the current state of regional scholarship, perhaps with regard to mobility and infrastructure studies, but more generally about the opportunities and challenges that regional scholars should be addressing these days.
Right. So again, as something of an ersatz regionalist, I won't necessarily speak with tons of confidence about the state of scholarship as a whole, particularly since I've had my nose buried in, like Spanish planning documents for the last quite a bit. But I can talk about some things that I'm excited about. You touched on the infrastructure, the question of infrastructure, and this kind of infrastructural turn that's growing quite robustly in regional studies. The way this is linked to questions of political rescaling as well, with the kind of uneven strengthening of regional planning in the United States, for example, but also elsewhere. So, I'm influenced by people like J.P. Addy, Teresa Enright, Miguel Canay, Jen Nellis, et cetera, who've kind of influenced my thinking on the sort of what is this a case of question when I'm approaching something like a bicycle infrastructure plan or the removal of a highway, and kind of thinking about this infrastructure and how it produces and shapes space and maybe reverberates beyond the immediate surroundings to become a sort of regional question, right? I also think that maybe to kind of continue on the infrastructural turn, I also think maybe the links to science and technology studies that are often implicit in a lot of the work on regional infrastructure could be often made a little bit more explicit. You know, we're talking about urban governments, right? Those are also technologies in many ways. Regional governments are technologies of kind of organizing space, and especially in the United States, there are these very kind of unevenly powered, kind of inchoate technologies of government that are sort of trying to become maybe new territorial containers without all necessarily the powers that go along with them. But, you know, thinking back to people like Robert Beauregard and others, and I mentioned Anike Hummels, like thinking about the very materiality of these infrastructures. What does a highway enable? How does the concrete in a highway link to the urban hinterland, right? Or a hinterland across the globe? What kinds of mobilities does it facilitate? What kinds of mobilities does it foreclose? What are the kind of infrastructural interdependencies that are the sort of landscape that regionalists, regional government, advocacy organizations, et cetera, have to deal with? I also think, you know, again, I'm sort of spitballing here, but I think the same could be said of connections to Black geographies. You know, it's easy to forget maybe sometimes that some of the foundational works from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Laura Polito, Bobby Wilson, Clyde Woods, Myron Orfield, are in very many ways informed by and intervening in regional studies, you know, especially, you know, Clyde Woods's work, and the questions of how regions are structured in dominance and produce specific racial formations. And it's especially, you know, important for my work in the United States, thinking about the racialization of the infrastructure itself. Organizations critiquing highway development back in the 1960s referred to them as white roads through Black bedrooms, right? And so I think there's a lot, you know, there's a ton of people doing this kind of work, but it can always be made more explicit, that sort of link between race and space at multiple scales, not just the urban neighborhood where it's often kind of bracketed, but the kind of the regional, what Laura Polito and also Wendy Chang referred to as sort of regional racial formations, right? Those have infrastructural bedrock and backbones.
I think that's a really important point to close on there. Thanks so much, John. That's all the time we have to talk today. I'd like to thank you for joining us to share your perspectives on urban and regional scholarship and the infrastructure turn. I'd also encourage all of you to learn more about the Regional Studies Association and regional studies at regionalstudies.org. John, would you care to have the last word today?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've had plenty of words already, but I'll throw in a few more. You know, I really appreciate kind of being part of these conversations. And also, again, it's important for people who may not necessarily see themselves as regionalists or who came into regionalism by sort of other routes, right? Regional studies, et cetera, to be addressing regional questions in both scholarship and teaching. You know, I now find myself teaching regional economic development, right? And having the kind of connections to other subfields within geography, urban planning, et cetera, you know, that's always strengthened by these kinds of conversations. And as you said, a kind of a more ecumenical approach to kind of regional studies.
Thanks so much.